When we think about competition, a rather evident image that comes to mind is a race where different people strive for the same objective. Each person visualizes themselves reaching the finish line first, but they also realize that there can only be one victor. The race itself is an explicit example where people are directly competing against one another, but the process that occurs prior to the race also embodies this concept. When a person trains for a race and other athletic competitions, they're competing against themselves by comparing their current progress to previous results. Meanwhile, they're also simultaneously competing against other people through the process of training for the event. The individual often doesn't directly acknowledge this fact until competition day, when they witness the tangible effects of their training. If they fail in their objective, to win, or at least place well, then it proves that their training was inadequate and they have to improve their methods for the next opportunity. So, it seems that a person simply can't compete against themselves alone, but rather, they should compete against themselves and also realize how they stack up against their competition. Today's discussion intends to explore the notion of competition, not just in terms of athletic endeavors, but for life in general. A particular question that will be explored is, should you compete with other people, or just yourself? Evidently, the implications of choosing to exclusively remain on either side of this topic will also be highlighted. What will ultimately be asserted, though, is that some competition between yourself and other people is necessary because you can't practically compete with just yourself. While your standards and benchmarks may be adequate in your own mind, it's frequently the case that they aren't sufficient to facilitate the success that you desire. Furthermore, we're inevitably influenced by standards that have been set by others, but this doesn't imply that we have to wholly succumb to them. To begin, should you only compete with yourself? Additionally, is this even possible? Before going any further, there are ostensibly two manners that you can interpret competing with just yourself. The first one is where you literally reject any notion of competing with other people. This naturally implies that you only compare your present results to your past results, and that you pay absolutely no attention to what others are doing. Meanwhile, the second interpretation is where you acknowledge that competition with other people is necessary up to a certain point, but you primarily focus on your development by comparing the present to the past. I accept the second interpretation because the first one is essentially impossible to apply in practice. You can't compete solely with yourself because you have to conform to, or at least acknowledge, the standards that are inevitably set by others. When you apply for a job, for example, you have to meet particular standards that have been set by the employer and not yourself. Furthermore, it's frequently the case that you have to go beyond the sufficient qualifications in order to land the position. This is especially valid if it's a highly sought-after position with numerous applicants vying for it. The point is that what you think is sufficient doesn't always translate into reality. You can't exclusively compare your present self to your past self because you must also be aware of how you compare to other people. When I was younger, I played competitive ice hockey from roughly age 5 until the end of high school. Hockey was my passion, and it captured my focus for a significant period of time. I can recall the countless hours of practice, and whether it was shooting pucks into a net, skating, stick handling, or studying some aspect of the game, I performed all of this with great enthusiasm. When I would reflect on my progress, how I improved from previous years, sometimes I thought that my development was sufficient. Inevitably, I discovered the validity of those beliefs when tryouts for rep teams, A and B, rolled around every September. When I made the teams I tried out for, those beliefs were confirmed. Whereas on the occasions where I failed to make those teams, then those beliefs were denied. I had to go back to the drawing board and put in a more substantial effort because my best simply wasn't good enough. During subsequent years after I initially failed, I succeeded in making the rep teams because I surpassed not only who I was previously, but also the present competition due to my increased dedication. Such is the nature of competition, but I learned to embrace this fact rather than run from it. I also learned from hockey that while you shouldn't focus too much on what others are doing, you always have to possess some awareness of where they are relative to yourself. You must realize where you stand amongst your competition, and if you're lacking in some areas, then you need to take the necessary actions to correct those shortcomings. I suppose what I'm attempting to articulate is this. Whether you're a hyper-competitive person or you don't care much about competing with others, you can't compete with yourself alone. You inevitably have to compare yourself to others to some degree. However, in the same vein, you also can't focus on other people to the extent that you lose sight of yourself. Focus primarily on your own progress and compare your present self to your past self. But Also be aware of whether the standards you've set for yourself are sufficient to obtain what you desire. A certain GPA or test score might be adequate in your own mind, but is it sufficient for where you want to go? I know this firsthand because I'm currently trying to get into law school. Having written the law school admissions test for the third time recently, I realized that I have to improve my score if I want to gain entrance into a commendable school. I can't just compete with myself because I'm competing with others who have a comparable objective. This challenge becomes even more arduous when you consider that there are, in the case of some law schools, thousands of applicants fighting for only a few hundred spots. So, by now we understand that we simply can't compete with just ourselves because we need some external competition to gauge our relative success in any endeavor. However, aforementioned above, I remarked that we can't focus on others to the extent that we become consumed by it. Some competition is necessary, but it's also not everything. If you make it the central focus, then you're likely to be dissatisfied for most of, if not all, the time. An example that aptly illustrates this point is the keeping up with the Joneses mindset. Just like the movie with the same name, it's where a person or group of people try to compete with others in what can really be described as a petty manner. This type of one-upmanship is quite prevalent in our society, and you don't have to look far to witness this phenomenon. When I drive on the roads these days, I tend to see numerous high-end cars that are often the same make and model. BMWs, Mercedes, Audis, Teslas, etc. I usually think to myself, do those people really need to drive those supposedly luxury cars? And are they doing it for themselves, or for other people? In other words, are they trying to flex on others and act in a vainglorious manner? Indeed, people don't need to drive those immensely pricey cars, but they often want to because they see others doing so, and because they're generally denoted as status symbols, like large houses and boats are. This type of competition, petty jealousy, and hive mind thinking can be extrapolated to other topics, but you get the picture. Competition, then, is certainly a double-edged sword. When used constructively, it compels us to improve and innovate. When used destructively, it causes us to become envious, spiteful, and vainglorious. Whatever you become competitive over, if you focus entirely on the competition without noticing your own performance, then you've already lost. Additionally, if you allow other people to significantly impact your decisions regarding your development, then you've already lost. Simply put, you must focus on your training, development, and progress to the degree where what others are doing becomes largely irrelevant. Furthermore, if you're putting in an immense amount of effort and dedication towards something, then other people's actions won't impact that and your results will speak for themselves. When the competition day arrives, you either succeed or you fail. If you fail, then it's back to the drawing board so you can learn from your mistakes. Figure out what you need to improve on so you can perform better at the next opportunity. Finally, your competitors aren't you, and as such, they won't have the exact same predicaments as you. You know yourself best, so keep this in mind for the endeavors that you're striving for. To conclude, it's essentially impossible to compete with yourself alone. The standards you set in your own mind aren't always going to be adequate in practice. You may think you're strong, but then you discover that there's someone who can outlift you, for example. What this means is that you shouldn't become discouraged, but rather you should possess some awareness of who you're competing with. Focus on your own development and take the necessary steps for success. If at first you fail, then try again, as the old saying goes. Compete with yourself and others, but don't become fanatical about it. Retain some humility and express gratitude for the opportunities you're afforded, because they can be taken away just as easily as they're granted. Competition isn't everything, and you can be satisfied in life without competing over every little thing. Ultimately, you must decide what you want to strive for and how much struggle is necessary to acquire it. It's ostensibly the case that the amount of hardship required to obtain what you desire is directly proportional to the reward itself. Knowing this, you must ask yourself, how badly do I want that reward, and am I willing to make the necessary sacrifices to obtain it?